To parse or not to parse? That is the question. When I first started Power Automate, I was using Parse JSON way too much, and I was causing myself a lot of pain and heartache using Parse JSON. Today, we're going to look at when you should use it, what it is, and when you should not use it. Okay, so here is our basic flow, and we have a get items, and we have a filter array, and I want to retrieve a data point or retrieve data out of the filter array. So if I come to the compose and I look at the filter array, I can't just retrieve anything out of the filter array. Now, when I was first starting Power Automate, I'm like, how do I get to the data in the filter array? I can see the item get items here, this information, but this information does not equal the filter array. So I was very confused. And then I learned about an action called Parse JSON. In which I just use the content from the body of the Parse JSON, and I put some schema in here, and then I get an output that I can use in my compose. And so let's run through this right quick. So in order to get the sample payload, we'll need to run this flow. So we'll go ahead and delete this step. And we'll delete the compose. And so there you see our flow ran successfully. We're just going to copy our outputs and go back to edit and search Parse JSON. And then using the body of the filter, and then use a payload, and then just paste that in there. And it will automatically create the schema and the JSON that we need for that filter array. So when we come in here and we do a compose statement, and we look at it, oh look, now all of these items that were not available to us before are now available to us from the filter array. Okay, so that's great, except for a couple of things. All right, so let's look at what the potential problems are here. First, let's look at what the Parse JSON schema really does. All right, so it says the type is an array. So as long as this body is always an array, that will be fine. And that's what we expect. And as long as you're passing each one of these items in, it'll be okay. And we always expect to have an ID and a title and a position. So that should be fine. What about a first name and a last name? Ought to always have a first name and a last name. But what if when we do the data entry, the first name is blank? So when it evaluated the schema, it just said the first name was always a string instead of a string or null. Date hired is always a string. Created is always a string. And then if you scroll down, it requires all of these fields. Right? And then you get all the way down, and all of these fields are always required. So if any of these fields are ever missing, then that step will fail. Okay, so now you have two potential problems that could occur. Right? One is if your type doesn't match, i.e. if it comes in as a null instead of a string, or if it's an integer instead of a number, or a number instead of an integer, right? Or a number instead of a string. Or if you don't have required items, or if the item is not really required, then you could have it show up as required here, but it's not really required. And so if it doesn't show up the next time, then that will cause an error also. Alternatively, you have something that is not part of your sample initially, but really ought to be part of your sample. It's not going to have a defined schema here as far as a string or number or integer. So it will not have a defined output if it is included in subsequent iterations. So those are reasons to not use Parse JSON if you are only doing it for the schema. Instead, what you can do is put the output of your filter into a WordPad or into a notepad, and then you have the schema that you need here already. When you look at the output from your filter, this is really showing you the columns from that SharePoint list. So this is your title column. This is your position column. And these are the different parts of your position column. This is your first name column, last name column, date hired, your created, modified. So how do you get to each of these different parts? So first is to understand that when you're talking about a SharePoint list, this is a object. So you need to understand that the output of the filter array is a body, which is annotated by these brackets with JSON. And so we need body, filter array, and then we want the first record, and the first record is always starts with 0, and then the number of record goes up from there. And then we want to know which column that we want. If we look at our notepad, we want the position, and we want the value inside of the position. So position, and then to get the value, we're just going to use the backspace and use value. Click add, click save, test. All right, and you look at the output of our compose statement, and the output is teacher, which is what we would expect, considering that we just filtered everything for the teacher value to begin with. So that is one way to get the value. Another way is to look at SharePoint directly. So when you look at your SharePoint list, if you click on the settings, list settings, you will see the list of columns, and you can click on the column itself that you want, and it will give you the details for that column. At the very top in the URL, it will have the name for the SharePoint column inside the URL that it is being recognized by. This is determined, this is created as soon as the column is created and does not change even after you change the column name. If you are working with Excel, the column name is just the top of the column that you are working with. Now, Power Automate does not work very well with Excel when it comes to spaces inside the column names. So if you need to add underscores to remove column names, then I strongly recommend that you do, or else you are going to get extra errors when you work with columns in Power Automate. A third data source that you could be working with is Dataverse. So in Dataverse, if you go to the columns for the table, you can see the list of all of the columns that inside of that table. You see the name, which includes the developer tag for that column name. If you click on the three dots, click Advanced, Tools, copy logical name, that will copy that column name, and you can use that as part of your schema. So when would you use a Parse JSON? I would use a Parse JSON if you have a CSV file that you want to define, or if you want to stop the flow if you do not have the defined fields that you expect to have at that point in your flow. If you liked this video, give me a thumbs up. If you're having problems with Power Automate, reach out to me at nextsteplowcodelabs@gmail.com, and I'll get you back to what you do best. Until next time, see you.